The dust settled on Emily's last hope, like ash on a dying fire. 3 days without work, 2 nights sleeping in her rusted Ford with Lily curled against her chest, and one final rejection letter that felt like a slap across her already bruised pride. The Carolina mountains stretched endlessly before them, beautiful and merciless, while her daughter's small hand clutched a wilted dandelion she'd picked from the roadside. Emily stared at the farmhouse in the distance, its chimney smoke rising like a prayer she'd forgotten how to say. She had nothing left to lose except the one thing that mattered most, and maybe, just maybe, that was exactly what would save them both. Subscribe to discover how desperation can bloom into the most unexpected love story. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty road as Emily Hawthorne pressed her forehead against the steering wheel of her battered Ford. The engine had finally surrendered 3 miles back, leaving her and 3-year-old Lily stranded on a stretch of Carolina back road that seemed to lead nowhere. The silence was deafening. No traffic, no signs of civilization, just the endless whisper of wind through tall grass and the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead. Emily's hands trembled as she counted the crumpled bills in her wallet for the 100th time. $17.32. Not enough for a tow truck, not enough for a motel room, not enough for anything that resembled hope. The weight of her failures pressed down on her shoulders like stones, each one heavier than the last. Lily stirred in the back seat, her small voice cutting through Emily's despair like sunlight through storm clouds. "Mama, I'm hungry," she whispered, her blue eyes wide and trusting in a way that made Emily's heart crack a little more. The last of their crackers had been finished yesterday, and the apple juice box lay empty on the floorboard, a reminder of how quickly their meager supplies had dwindled. Emily turned to face her daughter, forcing a smile that felt like broken glass against her lips. "I know, sweetheart. Mama's going to find us something to eat real soon." The lie tasted bitter on her tongue, but it was all she had left to give. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the car windows and carrying with it the scent of wildflowers and distant rain. The farmhouse appeared like a mirage through the heat shimmer, its white clapboard siding weathered but sturdy, surrounded by fields of corn that swayed in the afternoon breeze. Emily had been walking for what felt like hours, carrying Lily on her hip while her daughter's small arms wrapped around her neck like a lifeline. Her feet ached in shoes that had seen better days, and sweat beaded on her forehead, despite the mountain air's coolness. The house sat at the end of a long gravel drive with a wraparound porch that spoke of lazy summer evenings and sweet tea shared in comfortable silence. A border collie emerged from beneath the porch steps, tail wagging cautiously as it approached them with the measured gait of a dog that had learned to read strangers' intentions. Emily hesitated at the edge of the property, pride warring with desperation in her chest like 2 wild animals fighting for dominance. The front door opened before she could knock, revealing a man who seemed to fill the doorframe with his quiet presence. Jackson Reed stood well over 6 feet tall, his dark hair touched with silver at the temples, and his green eyes holding the kind of depth that came from years of solitude and contemplation. His clothes were simple, worn jeans and a flannel shirt rolled up to reveal forearms bronzed by honest work. But there was something in his bearing that spoke of education and refinement, carefully hidden beneath a farmer's practical exterior. He looked at Emily and Lily with an expression that was neither suspicious nor welcoming, but rather curious, as if they were an unexpected chapter in a book he'd been reading alone for too long. The silence stretched between them like a bridge. Neither was sure they should cross, while Lily buried her face in Emily's shoulder with the shy instinct of a child who sensed the weight of the moment. "Car trouble." Jackson's voice was low and measured, carrying the hint of an accent that suggested roots planted deep in southern soil, but watered by years of learning and travel. Emily nodded, her throat suddenly dry as dust, unable to find words that wouldn't sound like begging. She could feel his gaze taking in their appearance, her wrinkled dress that had once been her best, Lily's tangled hair that needed a mother's patient brush. the exhaustion that clung to them both like morning fog. There was no judgment in his eyes, only a quiet assessment that made her feel simultaneously exposed and oddly safe. The dog had settled at his feet, its brown eyes moving between Emily and its master as if waiting for some unspoken signal. Jackson stepped aside, gesturing toward the interior of the house with a movement that was both invitation and question, leaving the choice entirely in her hands. The kitchen smelled of coffee and fresh bread, simple scents that spoke of a life lived with intention and care. Jackson moved with the easy grace of a man comfortable in his own space, pulling out a chair at the worn wooden table and gesturing for Emily to sit, while Lily clung to her like a small koala. The room was clean but lived in, with books stacked on the windowsill and a coffee mug sitting beside the morning paper, evidence of solitary routines that had shaped the rhythm of his days. Emily sank into the offered chair, feeling her legs tremble with relief as the weight of carrying Lily finally lifted from her aching muscles. Jackson disappeared into the pantry, returning with a jar of peanut butter, a loaf of bread, and a glass of milk that he set before Lily with the careful movements of a man unaccustomed to small children but willing to learn. The simple kindness of the gesture hit Emily like a physical blow, threatening to crack the careful composure she'd maintained through 3 days of mounting desperation and fear. The sandwich disappeared from Lily's small hands with the desperate efficiency of genuine hunger, peanut butter smearing across her cheeks as she ate with the single-minded focus of a child who had learned not to waste food. Emily watched her daughter with a mixture of relief and shame, knowing that Jackson's quiet observation missed nothing. Not the way Lily's eyes had widened at the sight of food. Not the tremor in Emily's hands as she accepted the cup of coffee he'd placed before her without asking. The kitchen felt like a sanctuary after days of uncertainty, its warmth seeping into her bones and making her realize just how cold she'd been, not just from the mountain air, but from the chill of having nowhere to belong. Jackson sat across from them, his own coffee growing cold as he studied Emily with the patience of a man who had learned to read the land and weather, who understood that some things couldn't be rushed. The silence between them was comfortable now, broken only by Lily's contented humming and the distant lowing of cattle in the fields beyond the window. "How long since you've had a real meal?" Jackson's question was gentle but direct, cutting through Emily's carefully constructed pretense with the precision of a surgeon's blade. She felt heat rise in her cheeks, the shame of their situation burning like acid in her throat as she struggled to find an answer that wouldn't sound like a plea for pity. 3 days, she wanted to say, but the words stuck like thorns, too proud to be spoken aloud. Instead, she lifted her chin with the stubborn grace of a woman who had learned to carry dignity even when everything else had been stripped away. Jackson nodded as if her silence had told him everything he needed to know, his green eyes holding an understanding that spoke of his own familiarity with hardship and loss. The afternoon light slanted through the kitchen window, casting golden squares across the table and illuminating the dust motes that danced in the air like tiny spirits celebrating this moment of unexpected grace. Lily had fallen asleep in Emily's lap, her small body finally relaxed after days of tension and uncertainty, her breathing deep and even in the way that only children could achieve when they felt truly safe. Emily's arms had grown numb from holding her, but she couldn't bring herself to move, afraid that any shift might break the spell of peace that had settled over them like a warm blanket. Jackson rose quietly, returning with a quilt that smelled of lavender and sunshine, which he draped over Lily's sleeping form with the careful tenderness of a man who understood the preciousness of a child's trust. The gesture was so unexpected, so purely kind, that Emily felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, the first tears she'd allowed herself since this nightmare began. She blinked them back fiercely, unwilling to add the burden of her emotions to Jackson's already generous hospitality. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, marking time in a house where time seemed to move differently, more slowly, as if the outside world's urgency couldn't penetrate these walls. "I have a proposition for you," Jackson said, his voice barely above a whisper to avoid waking Lily, but the words hit Emily like thunder in the quiet kitchen. He leaned back in his chair, his hands wrapped around his coffee mug, as if drawing strength from its warmth, his eyes never leaving her face as he spoke. "This farm is too big for one man, and too quiet for someone who spent his whole life believing that family was the only thing that really mattered." Emily's breath caught in her throat, her heart beginning to race as she sensed the weight of what was coming, the way the air in the room seemed to thicken with possibility and danger. Jackson's next words came slowly, each one carefully chosen, like stones placed to build a bridge across an impossible chasm. "I'll be her father, if you'll be my wife." The proposal hung in the air between them like a challenge and a gift, simple words that carried the power to reshape 3 lives forever. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the steady tick of the clock and Lily's soft breathing against Emily's chest. Emily stared at Jackson, searching his face for signs of jest or madness, but finding only the quiet sincerity of a man who had weighed his words carefully before speaking them. Her mind reeled with the impossibility of it all, this stranger offering them not just shelter but a complete transformation of their lives, asking for nothing more than the chance to build something real from the wreckage of their separate solitudes. The rational part of her brain screamed warnings about the dangers of trusting too quickly, about the foolishness of binding herself to a man she'd known for mere hours. But beneath the fear and confusion, something deeper stirred, a recognition that felt almost like coming home, as if some part of her soul had been waiting for this moment without knowing it. Jackson waited with the patience of a man who understood that some decisions couldn't be rushed, his green eyes holding hers with a steadiness that spoke of roots planted deep and strong. "You don't know me," Emily whispered, her voice barely audible in the golden afternoon light that filled the kitchen like honey. The words carried all her fears and doubts, all the reasons why his offer was impossible, and all the desperate hope that maybe, just maybe, it wasn't. Jackson smiled then, the first real smile she'd seen from him, and it transformed his entire face, revealing glimpses of the man he might have been before life had taught him to guard his heart so carefully. "I know enough," he replied, his voice carrying the quiet confidence of a man who had learned to trust his instincts about people the same way he trusted them about weather and crops. "I know you'd walk until your feet bled before you'd let that little girl go hungry. I know you've got more courage in your little finger than most people have in their whole bodies, and I know that sometimes the best decisions are the ones that don't make sense to anybody but the people making them." His words settled over Emily like a benediction, offering her something she'd almost forgotten existed, the possibility of being truly seen and valued for exactly who she was. Sim, escrevos capítulos 3 to 5. The morning sun filtered through the kitchen window as Emily watched Jackson prepare breakfast with the same methodical care he applied to everything else. His movements were economical, purposeful, yet there was something almost reverent in the way he cracked eggs into the cast-iron skillet. She found herself studying the lines around his eyes, the way his shoulders carried some invisible burden that seemed to lighten only when Lily was near. The silence between them had evolved from awkward to comfortable, filled with the small sounds of domestic life that felt both foreign and achingly familiar. When he placed a plate before her, their fingers brushed briefly, and Emily felt something shift inside her chest, a recognition that this man's kindness wasn't born from pity, but from a deep well of loneliness that matched her own. The realization both terrified and comforted her, like standing at the edge of a cliff and discovering she might actually have wings. Jackson cleared his throat, his gaze fixed on his coffee cup as if it held the answers to questions he couldn't voice. "I've been thinking about what I said yesterday," he began, his voice carrying the weight of a man who'd spent sleepless hours wrestling with his own boldness. "About the arrangement. I want you to know there's no pressure, Emily. You and Lily can stay as long as you need, regardless of your answer." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken implications and careful boundaries. Emily felt her heart constrict at his gentleness, at the way he was already protecting her from feeling trapped, even as he offered her everything. She watched him run his thumb along the rim of his mug, a nervous gesture that made him seem younger, more vulnerable. The morning light caught the silver threading through his dark hair, and she found herself wondering what sorrows had put it there, what dreams he'd buried in the red dirt of his land. Lily's laughter drifted in from the porch, where she was playing with a collection of smooth stones Jackson had given her, each one carefully selected for its perfect roundness. Emily rose and moved to the window, watching her daughter arrange the stones in elaborate patterns, her small face serious with concentration. "She's never had space like this," Emily murmured, more to herself than to Jackson. In the city, everything was cramped, rushed. Even the playground was concrete and chain link. She felt Jackson's presence behind her, close enough that she could smell the clean scent of his soap, the faint aroma of hay that seemed to cling to his clothes. When she turned, she found him watching not Lily, but her, his dark eyes holding an expression she couldn't quite name. It was tender and hungry and careful all at once, the look of a man who'd learned to want quietly, without expectation. The intensity of his gaze made her breath catch, made her aware of how long it had been since someone had looked at her as if she were precious. "Tell me about your farm," Emily said, needing to fill the charged silence with something safe, something that wouldn't require her to examine the way her pulse quickened when he looked at her like that. Jackson's face brightened, and she realized she'd stumbled onto sacred ground. This land was more than property to him. It was identity, purpose, home. He led her outside, his hand hovering near the small of her back without quite touching, a gesture of protection that made her feel simultaneously cherished and independent. As they walked, he spoke of soil composition and crop rotation, with the passion of a poet describing his muse, his hands gesturing toward fields that stretched to the horizon like a green sea. Emily found herself caught up in his vision, seeing through his eyes the way morning mist rose from the pastures, the way the mountains cradled the valley like protective arms. When he paused beside a weathered fence post, his expression grew distant, and she sensed there were stories here he wasn't ready to tell, ghosts that walked these fields alongside his dreams. The afternoon brought unexpected visitors, neighbors who'd heard through the rural grapevine about Jackson's house guests. Emily watched from the kitchen window as Mrs. Patterson from the adjacent farm approached with a covered dish and the kind of purposeful stride that suggested she came bearing more than food. Jackson met her at the gate, his posture subtly defensive, and Emily could see even from a distance that he was fielding questions he'd rather not answer. When he returned to the house, his jaw was tight with frustration, and Emily felt a stab of guilt for the complications her presence was bringing to his orderly life. "Small towns," he said simply, setting the casserole on the counter with more force than necessary. "Everyone means well, but privacy is a luxury they don't understand." Emily nodded, understanding the weight of curious eyes and whispered speculation, the way a woman alone with a child became a subject of endless fascination and judgment. She wondered what stories they were already weaving about her, what assumptions they were making about Jackson's sudden acquisition of a ready-made family. As evening approached, Emily found herself helping Jackson with the evening chores, Lily perched on a hay bale, watching with wide-eyed fascination as he milked the cows. There was something deeply satisfying about the rhythm of farm life, the way each task connected to the next in an endless cycle of care and maintenance. When Jackson's hand covered hers as he showed her how to properly hold the milk pail, Emily felt a jolt of awareness that had nothing to do with farming techniques and everything to do with the warmth of his skin, the strength in his fingers. She pulled away too quickly, nearly spilling the milk, and saw understanding flash in his eyes. He felt it too, this unexpected current of attraction that complicated everything. As they walked back to the house in the gathering dusk, Lily's small hand in Emily's and Jackson's quiet presence beside them, Emily realized they looked like a family, moved like people who belonged together. The thought should have terrified her, but instead it filled her with a longing so sharp it took her breath away, a hunger for something she'd never dared to want. The third day dawned grey and heavy with the promise of rain, and Emily woke to find Jackson already gone from the house, his coffee cup washed and set in the drainer like a small act of consideration. Through her bedroom window, she could see him in the distance, mending fence with the kind of focused intensity that suggested he was working through more than just broken wire. Lily was still sleeping, her small body curled like a question mark beneath the quilt Jackson had pulled from some hidden closet, and Emily allowed herself a moment to simply breathe in the quiet. The house held a different quality of silence than she was used to, not the hollow emptiness of loneliness, but the full quiet of a place where someone lived with intention, where every object had purpose and history. She found herself wondering about the woman who had chosen the blue curtains in the kitchen, who had planted the herb garden that still grew wild beside the back door, and whether Jackson ever missed having someone to share the small rituals of daily life. When she finally made her way to the kitchen, Emily discovered a note propped against the coffee pot in Jackson's careful handwriting. "Gone to town for supplies. Back by noon. Make yourselves at home. J." The simple message carried an intimacy that made her chest tighten, the assumption that she would know how to work his coffee maker, that she belonged in his space, even in his absence. As she prepared breakfast, Emily found herself moving through his kitchen with surprising ease, her hands seeming to know instinctively where he kept the plates, the silverware, the honey he preferred in his tea. It was as if the house itself was teaching her its rhythms, welcoming her into its quiet embrace. When Lily appeared in the doorway, hair tousled and eyes still heavy with sleep, Emily felt a pang of recognition. This was what mornings could be like, unhurried and gentle, filled with the simple pleasure of caring for someone you loved in a place that felt like sanctuary. The rain began just after breakfast, a steady drumming against the windows that turned the world outside into a watercolor painting of greys and greens. Lily pressed her nose to the glass, fascinated by the way the drops raced each other down the pane, and Emily found herself remembering her own childhood fascination with storms. "Can we go outside?" Lily asked, and Emily was about to refuse when she realized there was no reason to say no. No schedule to keep, no neighbors to worry about disturbing, no landlord to complain about muddy footprints. The freedom of it was dizzying. This ability to make decisions based solely on what would bring joy rather than what was practical or expected. They spent the morning dancing in the rain, Lily shrieking with delight as she splashed through puddles while Emily stood on the covered porch, watching her daughter experience the kind of carefree childhood she'd almost forgotten was possible. When Jackson's truck appeared through the grey curtain of rain, Emily felt her heart lift in a way that had nothing to do with relief and everything to do with the simple pleasure of seeing him return. Jackson emerged from his truck with an armload of packages and the kind of soaked-through satisfaction that suggested he'd enjoyed the drive through the storm. He paused at the sight of Lily spinning in the rain, his face softening into an expression of such tender amusement that Emily felt something crack open inside her chest. "She's going to catch her death," he called out, but there was laughter in his voice, and when Lily ran to him with arms outstretched, he didn't hesitate to scoop her up, despite his dry clothes. Emily watched him carry her daughter toward the house, saw the way Lily's small arms wrapped trustingly around his neck, and felt the last of her carefully constructed walls begin to crumble. This man, who had offered them everything, was already loving her child with the fierce protectiveness of a father, and the realization left Emily breathless with gratitude and terror in equal measure. When their eyes met over Lily's wet head, Emily saw her own wonder reflected in his gaze, the shared amazement at how quickly they'd become something that looked like family. The afternoon passed in a haze of domestic contentment that felt both natural and surreal. Jackson had brought fabric from town, soft cotton in shades of blue and yellow, and Emily found herself sitting at his kitchen table with scissors and thread, hemming curtains for Lily's room while he worked nearby, repairing a bridle with the same careful attention he brought to everything. The rain continued its gentle percussion against the roof, creating a cocoon of intimacy that made the outside world feel very far away. Lily had fallen asleep on the living room sofa, exhausted by her morning adventure, and the house held the peaceful quiet of a place where people were content to simply exist in each other's presence. When Jackson looked up from his work to find Emily watching him, neither of them looked away, and Emily felt the air between them charged with possibility. "You don't have to answer yet," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of a man who understood that some decisions couldn't be rushed. "But I want you to know that this," he gestured around the kitchen, encompassing the domestic scene they'd created, "this feels right to me." As evening approached and the rain finally stopped, Emily found herself standing on the front porch with Jackson, watching the sun break through the clouds to paint the wet world in shades of gold and green. Lily was awake again, chasing fireflies in the front yard with the kind of uninhibited joy that made Emily's heart ache with love and possibility. "I've been alone for a long time," Jackson said suddenly, his voice so quiet she had to lean closer to hear him. "I'd convinced myself I preferred it that way. But watching you and Lily these past few days—" He trailed off, his hands gripping the porch railing as if anchoring himself against the vulnerability of his admission. Emily felt tears prick her eyes at the raw honesty in his voice, at the courage it took for a man like him to admit to loneliness, to want. When she reached out to cover his hand with hers, he turned his palm up to capture her fingers, and Emily felt the last of her resistance dissolve like sugar in rain. She was falling for this quiet man who offered love like shelter, who saw her daughter as a gift rather than a burden, who made her believe that maybe, just maybe, she deserved the kind of happiness she'd only ever read about in books. The fourth morning brought crystalline clarity, as if the rain had washed the world clean and left everything sharp-edged and new. Emily woke before dawn, drawn from sleep by the sound of Jackson moving quietly through the house, and she found herself padding barefoot to the kitchen, where he stood silhouetted against the window, coffee cup in hand, watching the sun paint the mountains in shades of rose and gold. He turned at her approach, and something in his expression told her that he, too, had spent the night wrestling with the weight of unspoken possibilities. "Couldn't sleep either?" he asked, and Emily shook her head, accepting the cup he offered with hands that trembled slightly from more than just the morning chill. They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the world wake up around them, and Emily felt the rightness of it settle into her bones, this quiet communion, this shared appreciation for beauty, this sense of being exactly where she belonged. When Jackson's shoulder brushed hers, she didn't pull away, and she felt him exhale as if he'd been holding his breath for days. "I need to tell you something," Emily said, her voice barely above a whisper, and she felt Jackson go, still beside her. "About Lily's father, about why we were really on that road." The words came slowly, painfully, like drawing splinters from a wound. The story of a man who'd promised forever and delivered only heartbreak, who'd left them with nothing but debt and broken dreams. Jackson listened without judgment, his presence steady and grounding as Emily laid bare the shame and fear that had driven her from everything familiar. When she finished, the silence stretched between them, heavy with the weight of her confession, and Emily braced herself for the inevitable withdrawal, the polite distance that would signal his change of heart. Instead, Jackson set down his coffee cup and turned to face her fully, his hands coming up to frame her face with a gentleness that made her breath catch. "Thank you," he said simply. for trusting me with that." And Emily realized that in telling him her worst story, she'd somehow given him her heart. Lily's appearance in the kitchen doorway broke the spell, her hair a riot of curls, and her eyes bright with the anticipation of another day in paradise. "Are we staying forever?" she asked with the directness of childhood, and Emily felt her heart stop at the question she'd been avoiding. Jackson crouched down to Lily's level, his expression serious but kind. "That depends on your mama," he said gently. "But I hope so. I hope you'll both stay and help me take care of this place. It's been lonely without a family." Lily considered this with the gravity of a judge, then nodded decisively. "I like it here," she announced. "And I like you. You smell like horses and sunshine." Jackson's laugh was rich and warm, and when he looked up at Emily over Lily's head, she saw her own future reflected in his eyes. Mornings like this, conversations like this, the simple joy of being wanted and cherished and home. The realization hit her like a physical blow, stealing her breath and making her knees weak with the magnitude of what he was offering. The day passed in a blur of ordinary moments that felt extraordinary in their simplicity. Emily helped Jackson with the morning chores, learning the rhythm of farm life, while Lily helped by collecting eggs, with the kind of intense concentration that suggested she was performing surgery rather than gathering breakfast. When Jackson's hand covered hers as he showed her how to properly milk a cow, Emily felt the spark of attraction that had been building between them flare into something deeper, more complex. She was falling in love, not just with his kindness or his stability, but with the man himself, with his quiet strength and hidden vulnerabilities, with the way he made her feel both protected and free. The realization should have terrified her, but instead it filled her with a sense of coming home, of finally finding the place where she belonged. When Jackson caught her staring at him across the barn, his own expression soft with wonder, Emily knew that he was feeling it too. This impossible, inevitable pull towards something that felt like destiny. The afternoon brought visitors again. This time Jackson's sister Sarah, a whirlwind of energy and curiosity, who arrived with homemade pie and barely concealed questions about the woman and child who'd appeared in her brother's life. Emily braced herself for judgment, for the protective suspicion of family, but Sarah's warmth was genuine, her delight in Lily immediate and unfeigned. "Jackson's been alone too long," she confided to Emily while they watched Lily show off her egg-collecting skills. "I was starting to worry he'd forgotten how to let people in, but look at him. I haven't seen him smile like that in years." Emily followed her gaze to where Jackson was patiently explaining the finer points of chicken care to Lily, his face animated with a joy that transformed his usually serious features. Sarah's words echoed in Emily's mind long after she'd left, carrying with them the weight of family approval and the recognition that what was happening between them was visible to others, real and significant and worth celebrating. When Jackson walked Sarah to her car, Emily saw them talking in low, urgent tones, and she knew they were discussing the future that hung in the balance of her decision. As evening settled over the farm like a gentle benediction, Emily found herself alone with Jackson on the front porch while Lily played in the yard, her laughter mixing with the evening chorus of crickets and tree frogs. The air was soft and warm, heavy with the scent of honeysuckle and the promise of summer, and Emily felt the weight of the moment settling around them like a cloak. "I have something for you," Jackson said quietly, reaching into his shirt pocket to withdraw a small velvet box that made Emily's heart stop. "It was my grandmother's," he continued, his voice rough with emotion. "I know this isn't conventional. I know we barely know each other, but Emily—" He opened the box to reveal a simple gold band set with a modest diamond that caught the last light of day and threw it back in tiny rainbows. "I meant what I said. I want to be Lily's father. I want to be your husband. I want us to be a family." Emily stared at the ring, at this tangible symbol of the impossible dream he was offering, and felt tears spill down her cheeks as she finally found the courage to reach for the happiness she'd never dared to believe she deserved. "Yes," she whispered, the word carrying the weight of every hope she'd buried, every dream she'd abandoned, every prayer she'd whispered in the dark. Yes, Jackson, yes to all of it.